Tushar, thank you for taking time to join us today in this episode of In a Pinch series. This is going to be one of my most favorite one, and I already can foresee the hundreds of people that are going to dial in because you happen to be, just like for me, their very favorite person, very favorite boss, very favorite mentor. I'm super excited to have you there. And just by way of intro, you've had an amazing, illustrious career, but where we intersected was some of the best, most memorable years of my career at PayPal. But on that note, would love to have you walk us through what your transition through so many different industries, from banking to payments to healthcare to AI. It's spanned so many verticals and so many roles. What was really the catalyst for you to make those changes, especially as you made that move with your family to Silicon Valley?
Yeah. So I appreciate that. That was a very nice introduction. I feel very honored to be here, obviously, with both of you, having worked with you in a great level of detail at PayPal. And hopefully, after that introduction, people will find what I say valuable. But it probably started pretty early on because pretty early on in my career, I actually did two international stints, one in the Netherlands and one in the UK. And for someone who's very much early on in their career to do that level of both probably professional culture and personal change made me kind of enjoy and really thrive in an environment where change and transformation and transition is a common theme. And so, as you mentioned, it is interesting as I talk to people I interview, or folks like you say that I mentor or coach or talk to. I talk about those kind of three major industry based experiences: internet telecom disruption, and obviously financial services disruption, and now obviously AI, and even to a certain degree, even though it was a small stint or a short stint, even healthcare and payments disruption. And then ultimately, obviously, the biggest disruption that's happening now, which is around AI. Now, obviously, it's interesting, as you guys all know, AI has been out there for a very long time. It's transformed itself as these transformer models have become available. And now with just how much ChatGPT and Claude and Gemini have democratized essentially the AI capability. You see it every day in every search you perform. People now use ChatGPT essentially as almost a common resource to do anything. So, but I think I've found myself always wanting to be in a transformational space. But I will be very honest, this is probably one of the ones that is the most accelerated at a velocity that I've never seen before. And being both a product leader and having done technology, um, a roadmap essentially today, even in the environment and the role that I played, doesn't stay beyond 60 to 90 days because of just how fast this technology, how fast these models, and the amount of funding, right? I think we saw that a lot during the hype cycle of payments, right? The number of payments companies, the number of fraud companies, the number of startups that were essentially being incubated by venture capitalists and others. We just see that now at hyperscale. I mean, every week you see at least another 5 to 10 companies along the spectrum of whether it be, silicon at the GPU level, inferencing, some aspect of modeling, agents. I mean, it's just across the entire board. There are upstarts coming, and it's also just become so much easier now to code and deliver technology at scale. There's a lot of discussions around, like, there's a 5 or 6 person startup already can deliver $30 million of revenue very quickly with Claude Code or Codex and so on and so forth. Kind of a
Yeah.
long answer, but I think early on, having thrown myself into international and culture and all of that, just I feel like that I think that's kind of just had me really thrive in a change and transformational space.
Yeah. We're going to dig in a little bit to your points around AI in a bit, but
Yep.
you brought up the rapid velocity of change transforming the industry. And something I've really admired about you for a long time, Tushar, like, you dive in head first, not always being the deepest expert, but building expertise really quickly, right?
Yeah.
And it's super critical skill to have, especially as you've gone across so many industries. Are there risks you worried about when you took these massive leaps? And like, what is your approach to building that expertise quickly and staying relevant when the industry is moving so fast?
Yeah, and I think it goes back to a little bit of what you said before, right? Which is, moving from location to location. But I think the biggest move was really drastic for me, which is obviously moving from Charlotte to the Silicon Valley when I took the job with PayPal. And, to be very frank, everybody can joke about the valley and how expensive it is and all that goes on here, but there are some of the brightest people in the world that that work here and that are doing business in Silicon Valley. And I think, for me, I think, coming from Charlotte, coming from a big bank now into a very accelerated, technology forward and broad based, and sitting in Silicon Valley with the amount of talent that was there, recognizing that you don't know everything. And so, I think this when I joined, I think the first 6 months that I joined PayPal, I really didn't say very much. I just spent a lot of time really just learning and listening. I think that is something that a lot of A-type personalities, people who want to lead from the front, sometimes have a hard time doing, right? They want to, they want to quickly make an impact. And I think sometimes just being humble and listening and then speaking when you feel like you really understand the problem statement or you understand the customer need, that's when you can actually make that impact. And then that continues to grow. Because I think not only that listening not only allows you to better understand the problem and frame this and the opportunity, but also show credibility to the folks that you're in the room with or you're working with, that you're listening to what they're saying, and then you're actually providing value added input. And there's a level of respect you gain from that input and that overall information that you provide during that interaction.
That's amazing. Great segue to talk about something that you've obviously done an amazing job of. You've run large teams successfully, like execution machines. We often talk about um, the PayPal Mafia, pretty like spectacular alumni group of PayPal folks. And honestly, PayPal has produced so many founders. But what in your mind was the reason for that? What was it about the culture that drove this much risk taking and innovation across the valley?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think you say startup, right? But even today, as I'm in the role that I'm in the company that I work with, we deal with a lot of enterprise companies globally, and the number of PayPal alumni that are actually in these enterprise companies and have really big roles. So it's not just the VC, definitely the VC play space. And I think that's a little bit of also just being in the Silicon Valley ecosystem. So I'll answer it two ways. I think one, because of the breadth of what PayPal, obviously now and what we were doing when we were there, it was so broad and it was so deep and it was across consumer and merchant and small business to mid-market to enterprise to, consumers that were based in China to Europe. So the level of kind of customer feedback and hearing what the customer needed, whether they were an enterprise customer or just a consumer themselves, would just essentially created a froth of opportunities and ideas, right? And when you recognize when you're in a big company, the company may not be able to solve all of those problems because they have to prioritize based on their balance sheet, what is important to them, drive shareholder value, customer value, and so on and so forth. There's an opportunity to say, hey, this is a pain point or this is an opportunity that ultimately PayPal is not fulfilling or some other company is not doing, or there's not a set of companies that can do it. And because I have the wealth of knowledge of understanding how that problem could potentially be solved, because I hear it or see it every day and we just can't address it, that obviously fosters the ability to go off and create a startup or in that area, like just like you guys are doing, right? You could have easily gone down the route of other, PayPalians who've gone off and done risk. But I think the fact that you are specializing in an area that is deep, it has a huge level of opportunity and return that really doesn't have the focus that it needs. I think it speaks volumes to, the fact that you recognize that even though people might say, well, returns in this area is a niche fraud area. I mean, it's a several billion-dollar opportunity that retailers, e-commerce providers, and it's just going to continue to grow because now things, as we talk about AI, like there's so much less now human involvement in potentially selection of the things that you want to buy, right? You now have a potential agent that's buying, clothes and merchandise and things on your behalf, and then all of a sudden you realize that they don't fit or they may not, be part of your style or whatever. So it's just going to continue to grow. So I think it's a great it was a great proving and playground, one, to learn where there are opportunities to solve a customer problem, but also grow your career and really bring, a level of thought leadership, understanding enterprise scale, at global levels, and understanding global cultures and all of that. Yeah, I think it was a very unique place from that
Yep.
perspective.
So true. And on that note, maybe a final question on teams and your own personal career before we transition into the exciting world of AI. You talked about teams and sort of fostering that culture. You've been an investor, you've been now at a few startups, you've been at enterprise companies at massive scale, leading teams of thousands of people. When you are looking at whether it's a startup or smaller execution teams, what do you feel is the winning formula? And maybe this is a little bit of both perspective and advice for us as well as we look to execute rapidly with what we're building. What are those 2 or 3 non-negotiable traits you look for as a signal for a winning team?
Yeah. So I think it's a couple of things. One is, do you understand, do you have a sense of the domain or the problem space or the customer space that you're going into and what you're actually trying to solve? Are you keeping close to the customer throughout your entire journey from 0 to 1? Because things ebbs and flows, technology change, people change, industries change, customer demand changes. So that's one. That also, if you're keeping close to that space and you understand and you're evolving as the space is evolving, are you also staying somewhat focused on where your priorities need to be at the foundational level and not chasing every shiny object, right? Because you can't chase every shiny ball. Otherwise you won't get anything done. Everything will be essentially half delivered or it'll be a half baked product. The second is, is everybody that is joining, do they feel a sense of responsibility and accountability to not only themselves, but the person sitting to the left, to the right, or in front of them or behind them? That's extremely important. And then I think the third thing is being humble. So making sure that you're open to, that diversity of bringing in that thought leadership and knowing when to do it, and leveraging, obviously your board, your advisors to help you guide you.
That's great advice and something that we're actively thinking about. Thank you for that. We're going to transition a little bit to talk
Okay.
about AI and fraud.
Yeah.
Jen, you want to pick it up?
Yeah. So start with the news that's been going around LinkedIn and Twitter was quite a bit last week.
Right.
We had this Anthropic safety lead resigning and warning the world in this very ominous tweet about how the world is in peril and how innovation is outstripping wisdom.
Yeah.
Now, you are at Uniphore in the position you are, operate at the edge of Agentic. How do you balance this breakneck speed with the need for safety and human values?
Yeah. So I think, it was something that, I got a chance to go to Davos for the first time ever in my career. And I think, I stated it there in my kind of recap. There was a lot of discussion about this concept of human led AI, right? And I think even at Uniphore, and that kind of resonated with me because I think that is something that we're doing at Uniphore. What it kind of human led AI is being defined as is humans set the goals. They define the values. They should be defining the guardrails for these AI systems. They should be really thinking about how do they want these agents to perform. In other words, the agent shouldn't replace human judgment, right? That becomes really critical. And when you as an organization or any company allows AI to take over judgment, today, for example, you use AI to help you with that white space of helping write maybe a requirements document or a user story, right? But that's you're kind of driving and saying, hey, I need this help to augment what I'm thinking. You're not letting it replace your judgment on whether something's going to get implemented or not. Once you let the AI just completely take over and make those judgment calls, then you get to that slippery slope, right? So you got to keep obviously safety and governance, explainability, the modularity of what you do, making sure that you have a sense of what are the various edge cases that could potentially be, a derivative of certain decisions that your AI is making, right? So it's also just, important to have some ethical standards and understand what responsible AI means to you. And, part of it also just becomes when you obviously deal internationally, right? There are international regulatory requirements, in Europe and others. And so those become forcing factors. But I think it's more than anything, it's about being making sure that it's a human-led AI versus AI leading the human. So that's really
Uh,
kind of what keep front and center when we think about stuff here at Uniphore.
yeah, definitely food for thought. Thank you for that, Tushar. Sort of on a related note, and this has got more to do with applications. I think when this whole LLM and Chat GPT landed, customer support was probably one of the earliest adopters of this.
Yep.
Now we're seeing Uniphore leading the way in Agentic. According to you, what's sort of the next frontier for adoption? Or in short, where am I investing all my K? And not this is not investment
Not
advice,
stock
but
advice.
The predictive market seems to be where everybody's putting their money. And I don't know how they're skirting the gambling rules and regulations, but that's a whole nother conversation. Clearly, as you said, right, CXCS it was a clear kind of first tier, AI, transformational space. I think obviously coding and engineering is a very fast follower. As you guys know, in AI has been around for risk and compliance for a very, very long time. You now just see recently, right? Goldman Sachs just mentioned that they're now leveraging agents to do compliance and all this other stuff. So I think it's what I would say is it's less probably about potentially the vertical business. It's more about where a company is with their capabilities, right? What we discover in any organization, whether they are a small business, mid-market, or large enterprise, it's the haves and the have-nots. It's, a Goldman can go do because they can buy the talent. They can get the talent that they need that can go in there, leverage these anthropic models and build these agents. And they obviously know how to get to the data, and they can essentially build these compliance agents and feel somewhat confident. Now, obviously, we all know they're probably not, there's definitely human in the loop. There's just no way that they would allow an agent to do an end-to-end compliance. But then you have the have-nots, right? That just, unfortunately don't have the data scientists, don't have the data engineering capability, the skill set. And so I think it's more about looking at this from both an industry lens. So you see, obviously, clearly banking, telecom, all of those are moving a lot faster with AI than traditionally maybe hospitality or transportation, just because it's becomes more of around the skill set, the history of the company, the history of the systems that they have. Because remember, this is no longer just about like, hey, how do I migrate from this application to this application or this platform from this platform? It's like, hey, how do I actually plug this into what I'm actually doing? And now it needs to be part of everything that not only my humans do, but all of my various business functions. And so how does this not only plug into my technology stack, but ultimately, how do I integrate it into my overall processes? And a lot of the use cases we see still involve some level of human. It's actually around productivity gains and increasing productivity versus completely removing that person from that role. Does that make sense? It's how do I drive more productivity so that the folks that I have in my organization are more productive and can take on more and take on more depth and can then look at the bigger problem or opportunity space versus potentially just eliminating the role. Don't get me wrong like that, but I think there's a little bit of this, as we all know, right? Because you guys are, in the front, it's all about kind of cost optimization and OpEx. But what we're seeing is it's like, hey, how do I make my employee or my associate much more effective
more
in their
productive.
jobs? They can actually take their level of experience and knowledge and help me solve the problems that I have not been able to get to. So I
Yeah,
think it's
no,
like,
makes
so
sense.
to answer your question, I think it's more just around where the industries are. And then within that, where do they want to focus their attention to your point, whether it be the call center space, fraud, the developer community, employee efficiency, so on and so forth.
Awesome. Okay, very helpful. I'd like to maybe shift a little bit towards fraud and abuse. Like, look, let's start with maybe at PayPal. We spent decades perfecting, identifying a bad actor.
Yep.
At Pitch, in the space where we operate, we are seeing this nuance of first party abuse really picking up, and these are everyday people that abuse policies. So
Right.
when you think about it, it's not stolen cards, it's not stolen identities, it's not masking identities. It's just regular everyday people that try to
Yeah.
do this and see if they can get away with it. So I guess my question to you is, if you put your platform architect hat on, how would you build a system that detects bad intent from, say, a good person
Yeah.
versus a bad actor with a stolen identity?
Yeah, I think, when I think about any fraud system, it's always about kind of what are the various signals that you want to be able to detect against, right? And it could be, the most important is what are those behavioral, what we call fingerprints that exist around a cohort or a set of users that would potentially put them into an abuser, right? Not a fraudster, but like an abuser, right? An abuser could also be a fraudster, but could also just be, myself, right? Like I went and bought a jacket for the Oscars and then I returned it right after that event because I, didn't want to pay the $500 or $700 for that velour jacket because was only going to use it once for one event, right? So I think it's understanding that kind of those behavioral fingerprints. I think the second is just like even with AI today, right? It's about what is that graph? What is that knowledge graph? How do you build that ontology of understanding of what those cohorts look like and what are those common behaviors and build those knowledge clusters so that you have a better understanding of how do you cluster the various potential abusers. Okay, now that we want to rate these clusters, what overall kind of activities, and those would go all into the kind of the risk scoring of that cluster or cohort of potential abusers. Then it's also around how do you then create the right levels of friction, but ultimately, how do you create some type of tool that allows you to be able to determine whether, that cohort should be getting some type of an experience that's obviously not completely punishment, but some type of kind of second order effect that stop them from wanting to do something, especially if they're a regular customer, right? Because they're like, well, I get it. Maybe I need to take a second thought and maybe go to TJ Maxx and get that velour jacket instead of trying to buy it from Nordstrom's and then just return it later type of thing. So I think it's just, making sure that you create some type of a friction or some type of a step up that makes that abuser maybe think twice. And then I think finally it's how do you get those contextual signals, right? How do you separate what someone's trying to do versus what is their true intent? You obviously don't want to punish loyal and good customers. So that also
Mm.
becomes part of your clustering, your definition of those cohorts. And that really just speaks to the value of the data that you need to be able to have. And your platform needs to be able to collect both what I would say real data, both structured, unstructured, as well as potentially synthetic data that you would need to be able to create.
Like uh it's almost like reading our minds. So much good stuff in that, Tushar. I just wanted to sort of segue at this point a little bit more into sort of the mindset of the folks that we sell to. We look at mid-market enterprise retailers,
Right.
and the way we position ourselves, it's about, hey, let's try to protect margin. Let's try to improve experiences for great customers. Let's try to save you time and effort and manpower, right? How do you coach a leader in one of these companies to justify the need to invest in sort of a nuanced risk system? So, yeah, very curious to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, so I think it's a combination of things. I think one, it's communicating that your fraud costs you X, but when you look at your actual policies, how blunt are your policies that you've implemented to potentially reduce your fraud? But then also how much is it also self-inflicting you on the revenue side? Because if you potentially implement policies that you think are going to fix fraud, you may not be looking at the other side of the equation, which is also it's going to impact your revenue. And so therefore, it's important that you have a sense of when you push certain levers, what are those levers actually impacting more holistically? And so it's also, having the conversation around maybe you have more of a measurement problem and without actually understanding what you are measuring against and what you are putting in your measurements. Like, for example, the amount of postage the amount of CX support that is going into customer service, the amount of inventory that you're now having to carry. Now you have an inventory management problem, especially if you're in the retail space, and it becomes a bigger seasonal issue. So it's almost like framing and understanding the problem statement from all aspects of the business, and understanding as you make certain decisions on certain level or make certain decisions on certain levels, what will be the positives and the negatives across these numbers. And so maybe I fight fraud and I decrease fraud, but now I've impacted this level of revenue, or also have now impacted these high net worth or high valued customers, right? So I think there's a natural tendency to take a very myopic center view, but I think understanding the bigger picture and making sure that they're looking at what's important to them, right? The fraud manager is looking at the fraud number. Customer service person is looking at NPS and OpEx. The CFO is looking at probably everything. And the CEO is just like looking at reputation and overall balance sheet. And so I think it becomes really important to say, hey, you may not have a return problem, but you have a bigger problem because these aspects of what's happening in returns is impacting these other measurements or these other financial levers that are important to you.
Makes a lot of sense. I have like one more, and this is more of a prediction
Okay.
question before I
Yep.
hand it over to Arti. We were at NRF in Jan. Sundar was at keynote, and Google announced its UCP protocol in conjunction with Shopify, Walmart, a whole bunch of big hitters. The promise is, you've got these protocols through which retailers can list practically every piece of their inventory that's available for all of these LLM search engines to pick up. And so everybody is going to be making purchases through a chat interface or talking to an AI agent.
Right.
So I guess, how bullish are you about agents or agentic commerce taking off to a level where agents are making purchases for us even before we knew we wanted something, right? Well, hey, my smart fridge has figured that I'm running low on milk, and this thing is
Right.
already
Right.
placed an order. And by the time I've gotten home, these products are already available. In fact, they even went a step further where, Google also has information about your credit card, so it can execute payments on your behalf,
Right.
maybe even trigger refunds because it's figured that something's going to go wrong. And so, yeah, just curious, right? Like, do you see humans generally cede that level of control away where we trust agents to be making decisions, especially as it pertains to commerce? I guess that's the
I mean, I
question.
think that clearly is a generational thing. I mean, as you guys remember, right? We saw that at PayPal, right? I mean, especially having been at Bank of America and then coming to e-commerce, you could see the cohort of people at Bank of America who used to go to the branch. They were gray hairs, right? They actually went there probably not really to bank, but to just be social and have coffee and eat the donuts. And they know the people that worked in the branch, right? But then, as you know, and that's why like Venmo and PayPal and other things took off, because the generation of users, like my two girls who are, 24 and 21, like, they don't even know what like when you show them a check, they're like, what am I supposed to do with this? Right. Like, so I think what I would say, and that's what I was saying to you guys earlier. I mean, looking, I mean, Amazon's kind of, if you think about it, subscription is like an agent, right? Like when you sign up for an Amazon subscription, it's essentially fulfilling a reoccurring subscription for you for your dog food or whatever you're going to need on a regular basis, right? And but I think, like I said before when we started, I think that's where returns and aspects of what you guys do is going to become important, because there's going to be, just like, for example, we all are probably on multiple subscriptions, right? Netflix, Apple TV. When people don't even realize that they're actually paying for two Netflix accounts. Like you know what I mean? Or like, so I think what ends up happening is when you allow AI make that judgment for you, there's going to be things that eventually will change in your life, right? You might change in size. Unfortunately, your pet might pass away and you have a subscription to get dog food on a regular basis, right? So until the agent can actually understand all those life-changing events as well, like there's gonna, think do think that the generation of users will start to leverage technology in a much more accelerated way. I do think that, there will be a point where we will allow agents to do stuff on our behalf. We will essentially give it some type of very simple prompt and it'll go do it. That's where I think that when things become much more and more automated, that's where things like what you guys are trying to help solve for enterprises and companies becomes really important. And as you and I both know, you can do as much UPCing as you want, but product and SKUs are constantly changing and they're
Mm,
continuously evolving and they happen, across the board, right? Boar's Head might put a UPC or Ralph Lauren might put a UPC item on a piece of cloth or on a jacket, and jacket styles and all that change. And so there's going to be, I think these things you're talking about are not static. And so there's going to be a need to be able to manage things that are not static. And like I said, things are going to show up at your house that you were not expecting, and you're going to want to be able to return it. And I think there's got to be an understanding of at that point, then, if especially if agents are doing it, and that becomes, if you go back to our earlier conversation, like understanding of behaviors becomes a little bit harder now because it's essentially an AI that's actually
yep.
doing these behaviors and not an actual human. The three of us could be an agent, right? And so now all of a sudden, how do you determine, okay, well, this agent really isn't an abuser. It just wasn't prompted correctly to do what needed it or didn't make the changes that the user wanted it to make, right? So I think the challenge becomes a little bit harder because at that point you might potentially be impacting a good user or a loyal customer because they have an agent doing something on their behalf. And so I think, if you're able to figure out how to help solve those types of challenges, and it goes back to, like I said, not a policy or potentially fraud, but how do you look at the overall measurements, you know what I mean, that an enterprise is trying to deliver against, and how do you weight, how do you bring that value that kind of starts to set you guys apart from others?
Yeah. Well, we're all for second level effects. Arti, I'll hand it
Yep.
back to you.
Um, on that very informative note, want to transition to a quick lightning round, Tushar.
Sure.
These are questions I want you to answer. First thing that is top of mind
Okay.
for you in a line or two.
Okay.
Ready?
Yes.
Okay. In your career, what has been the biggest sort of in a pinch moment, crisis where you had unclear data, but you had to make a decision based on intuition and a bet that you were making on the future?
It always comes down to the people. I lean towards the people and putting the right people on the right problem, especially when I don't know what the answer is, pulling people out of what they might be doing because I think they're the right people to try to solve the problem.
Yep. Awesome. We kind of touched about this when we were talking about AI and fraud in general. But if you looked at a business and saw that they had relatively high returns, 15% of their returns may be abusive, but they may be writing it off. And this cost may be hidden as customer service or logistics. What would be the first piece of advice you would give to their CFO or their CEO to kind of focus back on their margin?
Yeah, I think it goes back to what I was saying earlier, right? Which is let's not just look at the fraud. Let's look at all of the things that are a part of that problem statement, right? Because, for example, like I said, if your call center operations and the calls are going through the roof, that's obviously impacting your OpEx. Therefore, your margin is being depressed. Or so I think it's looking at, because the ultimate thing is, if you just look at one measurement, which is just margin, you'll end up taking a blunt approach to something. And you obviously, there's a natural reaction immediately to look at cost because that's a big factor in overall margin, but that may not be the right answer. Because in the end, you might be potentially, your NPS will then you'll sink your NPS and so on and so forth. Then you'll have other problems.
Yeah. Very, very, very helpful. Okay. On a more personal note,
Yeah.
and there may be too many for you to pick one, but I'll ask you to pick one. But what was one piece of advice that you gave me at PayPal that I ignored, but is very relevant to me as a CEO today?
As I've always said to you, you're going to almost always be the smartest person in the room, but you got to be humble and listen to what your customer is saying and meet your customer where they are.
I remember that and I try to live it. So thank you. And
Yeah.
my
Well,
favorite one.
I haven't experienced it yet, but he's hoping. He's maybe on a practice on him.
Okay, this is my favorite one so far about you. You have always talked about incredibly strong women in your life, whether it's your mother, your sister, your
Yeah.
amazing wife, your amazing daughters. How has that foundation and being surrounded by all these incredibly strong, articulate, smart women, how has that really shaped your leadership style. This is especially important, I think, because you have straddled often male dominated industries, whether it be fintech or AI.
Right.
How has that really shaped your leadership style?
So I think it's two things. One, I'm a firm believer, in my view, it's not diversity and inclusion as getting to equality. It's actually getting that level of thought leadership around you. That's really how I look at DEI. And that's why for me, having that level of diversity around the table of not just females, but people of color, different cultures, all of that is extremely important. And then I think the second thing is to your point, having two daughters, and ultimately, the males of any sort, there's always some level of advantage we have. And so for myself, it's, a little bit of personal in that I would hope that at some point somebody plays it forward for my girls. And if I can change, one or two or three people's approaches to understanding how much diversity matters in any form, then because like I said, that if you hire 100 minions that are like you, then you're never going to really achieve success in my mind.
No, that's probably my favorite answer. And on that note, thank you, Tushar, for making time for us. We have always valued your advice. You've been part of our journey since before we were thinking of coming together as a team, and really appreciate all the insights, especially as this industry is moving so fast. So thank you.
Right. It was great to see you. I appreciate it. And look forward to seeing you guys your continued success.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
Have a great weekend.